Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 16 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about the ingathering and the millennium. So people sometimes wonder what these terms ingathering and the millennium refer to. So in the simplified version of the timeline, we've been talking about Armageddon and how it's the wedding feast. And this is where the second of the takings or the raptures or the catching away occurs. And then after this comes the ingathering, and we'll talk more about that. And after the ingathering, then Yahweh's people live in the land for 1,000 years, ruling and reigning with his spirit. Then after this point in time comes the second war of Gog and Magog, where Yeshua again shows up to help Israel overcome and win. And then the earth continues for a little while before its final destruction at Yeshua's fourth and final coming. And then we all go to the white throne judgment. So, but again, people say, where do you get this concept of 1,000 years? And it derives from what's called a sod or a secret level analysis of Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, "Then Elohim, or God, blessed the seventh day and set it apart, because in it he rested from all his work which Elohim had created and made." So the idea is that Yahweh worked for the first 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested, and he blessed that day, and he set it apart. He made it special. There's something special about it. So then if we go to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, the apostle Peter, or Kepha, tells us a secret. He says, "Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with Yahweh, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day." So there's different rules for interpreting scripture prophecy. In Ezekiel 4, we get the principle that 1 prophetic day can equal 1 earth year. But there's other places where 1 day can be equal to 1,000 earth years. And Genesis 2 and verse 3 is one of these times. So what this gives us the concept of is what's spoken of sometimes. They talk about a 6,000 year plan for man and then 1,000 years for Yahweh. But as we will see, it's not exactly 7,000 years. It has to be a little bit more than 7,000 years. And this is reflected in what's called the 8th day assembly, or it's the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot in the fall. And we see this in Numbers chapter 29 and verse 35. Yahweh says, "On the 8th day you shall have a set-apart assembly. You shall do no customary work." So what the 8th day assembly, what Shemini Atzeret turns out to be, is it's just we end up meeting the morning after the 7th day. So we get a full 7 days, and people don't leave early, perhaps. It's interesting to take a look at the word atzeret. The root of this word is the Hebrew word atzar, which is Strong's Old Testament 61:13. It's a primitive root, and it means things like to enclose or to hold back, to detain, to keep or retain or shut up. Maybe some people have the concept that you would hold someone from leaving, or perhaps a tarry kind of a service. And this is what we see in the simplified version of the timeline, is that after the millennium, after the 7,000 years, there's still a little bit to do. There's still a second war of Gog and Magog, and the earth has to continue a little while before it's finally destroyed. And we'll talk more about that in future slide sets. But right now, we'd like to rejoin the Revelation timeline in Revelation chapter 19. And there's a lot that's gone on in chapter 19 because there's so much happening here. But Revelation 19 and verse 19 tells us, "And I saw the beast," meaning the Babylonian beast, "and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophet, who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone." And that is the last we will see of the beast and the false prophet. We'll see Satan again, but we won't see the beast and the false prophet again, because Babylon is judged at trumpet 7, and then the cups of judgment are poured out upon her, And even in her last rebellion gathering together at Armageddon, still she's defeated with the help of Yeshua. So continuing in verse 21, it says, "And the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse. And all the birds were filled with their flesh." And again, this is the wedding feast. Yahweh's making a covenant with the beasts of the field and with the birds of the air. So we continue on to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 1, and it says, "Then I saw a messenger coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand." And we need to understand that Revelation is a vision, so this isn't a literal bottomless pit. This is a spiritual bottomless pit, as it were. So verse 2, "He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him, so that he should deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were finished." So there's the millennium again. "But after these things, he must be released for a little while." We'll see that in the next slide set. He marshals the armies of the world together toward the second war of Gog and Magog, as it is here in the simplified version of the timeline. So here comes the interesting part, and this is where all the discussion is. So Revelation 20 and verse 4, he says, "And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them." He says, "Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Yeshua and for the word of Elohim, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years." And there are a lot of people who believe that this takes place physically on earth, but my understanding is that this takes place in the heavenly realms, because John is telling us that he saw the souls. That's not something you can do here on earth. And there are other reasons. For example, it's impractical. One theory that you hear is 144,000 believers lined up sitting on thrones to Yeshua's left or to Yeshua's right. But if we think about this logically, if you take 144,000 thrones and space them 1 meter apart, which isn't a whole lot of room for a throne, that would stretch for 144 kilometers, which is just about 90 miles. Now, it's only 37 miles to Tel Aviv, and that's not even a straight line. So what this tells us is that if we were to line up 144,000 thrones to Yeshua's left or right, over half the thrones would be either out in the Mediterranean or out in the Dead Sea or something to that effect. So continuing in verse 5, it has to be a spiritual, this has to take place in heaven. Verse 5, it says, "But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection." Verse 6 says, "Blessed and set apart is he who has part in the first resurrection." And we understand that to mean that whoever is spiritually taken, whether it's in a harpazo or a taking away, a lakachat, he says, "Over such the second death has no power," because Yeshua has come to take the spiritual body with him. He's not going to take the spiritual body with him and then allow us to fall prey to the second death. He says, "But they shall be priests of Elohim and of Messiah, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And their reigning with him will be in the throne room in heaven." That's where they sit on thrones. And this agrees with other verses, other passages that we've seen so far, such as Revelation chapter 2 and verse 26. It says, "And he who overcomes," which is another name for Israel, the overcomers of Elohim, "he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron," he says, "as I also have received from my Father." So in Psalms chapter 2, Yeshua receives a rod of iron from his Father, and then he hands it to his body. And his body is the one ruling and reigning over the nations in his stead, while Yeshua is in the throne room in heaven for the 1,000 years, with the souls of those whom he has already taken up in the taking aways, the harpazos. This also agrees with Daniel chapter 7 and verse 27, Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. In other words, is given to Yeshua's body. It says his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all kingdoms shall serve and obey him. So notice that even though the kingdom and dominion is given to Yeshua's body, his body rules and reigns in his stead. And even though the nations then obey his body, this counts the same as if the nations were all obeying him. So that's the relationship that we're going to have. And one of the reasons why this relationship is going to be special is we will be married to him at that point. So again, let's back up just a little bit. Let's go to the wedding feast in Hosea chapter 2 and verse 18. It says, "And in that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and with the birds of the air and with the creeping things of the ground. Bow and sword of battle I will shatter from the earth to make them lie down safely." He says, "I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahweh." And what's one of the very first things we want to do as soon as we know who Yahweh is and who he's called us to become? We want to go back home. We want to go live in his land. And this is why we get the ingathering. And this is why Jeremiah chapter 23, starting in verse 7, says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, that they shall no longer say, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt." He says, "But as Yahweh lives, who brought up and led the descendants of the house of Israel from the north country," meaning from the Assyrian dispersion, "and from all the countries where I had driven them, and they shall dwell in their own land." So again, we're speaking about a very great second Exodus, a very great ingathering, primarily of the Assyrian diaspora, but also somewhat of the Babylonian exile. So if we remember from the first slide set, the Assyrian diaspora began around 722, 723 BCE, and the Assyrians came in from the north, and they took all of the 10 northern tribes of the house of Ephraim, or the house of Israel, except for some of the poorest of the land. But they didn't stop at the border. So they came into the southern kingdom of Judah, and they took all but 3 of the walled cities of Judah. So this is why it says the 10 tribes, because it's effectively the dispersion of the northern house of Ephraim. But in reality, there's 12 tribes in this Assyrian dispersion, or elements of all 12 tribes in the Assyrian dispersion. And again, this is why the Yaakov, or James, says, Yaakov, a bondservant of Elohim and of Yahweh Yeshua Messiah, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. So we have elements of all 12 tribes in the Assyrian diaspora alone. But again, it's not only the Assyrian diaspora, there's also elements of the Babylonian exile. So whether the Jews among us come either from the Assyrian dispersion or from the Babylonian exile, because remember, Babylon's going to fall at trumpet 7. Babylon will be fallen at this point. So Judah will also be seeking pure truth at this point. So this is why it says, also speaking about the ingathering, Jeremiah 3 and verse 18 says that in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north, a reference to the Assyrian dispersion, to the land that I have given as an inheritance to your fathers. And the significance of the term walk, a lot of people have been taught that Yeshua appears in the clouds and raptures everyone up to be with him in the clouds, and they all fly back to the land of Israel with their Ray-Ban sunglasses on, or whatever they do. And Scripture doesn't support this theory. Scripture says that we're going to go back to the land by natural means, whether it's physically walking because there's been so much nuclear strike and EMP that all the vehicle transport is fried, or for whatever reason, walking seems to indicate that we're going to go back to the land by natural means. And we'll talk more about that in a much later slide set. But Isaiah gives us much the same picture. So Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 20, this actually refers to a different event, but it's the same time frame. Then they shall bring all your brethren for an offering to Yahweh out of all nations, on horses and in chariots and in litters, on mules and on camels, to my set-apart mountain Jerusalem, says Yahweh. So again, we don't know if if the camels, mules, and litters, if those are references to the trains, planes, and automobiles that will be in those days, or if we will physically take natural and animal modes of transport home. But we do know that Yeshua's followers are going to come from every nation on earth, just as Yeshua also says in Luke 13 and verse 29. Speaking about the ingathering, he says, and they will come from the east and the west, and from the north and the south, and sit down in the kingdom of Elohim. So when we get back to the land, we're going to have to appoint some form of governance for ourselves. So Babylon has fallen. All of the Babylonian governments of the world, all those mountains have been displaced. They have all fallen. And so this is why Hosea chapter 1 and verse 11, it's Hosea 2 and verse 1 in the Hebrew versions. It says, then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head. And they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. So sometimes people say that this applies to Yeshua because they want to make it seem like the people will be appointing or electing or selecting Yeshua. But these kinds of scenarios don't make sense, because if you've got the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the conquering king returning victorious over the armies of Gog and Magog, it doesn't make sense that the people are going to need to hold a vote or an election or some kind of a popular referendum for him. That only makes sense in terms of a human leader. So, but we also know that we will be transitioning at some point in time to the millennial form of government, which will be a prince that's found in Ezekiel's temple. So Ezekiel 40 through 46 speaks of a temple that has not yet been built, and it is ruled over by a hereditary prince. And people want to say, aha, that's Yeshua. We know a prince means Yeshua because of Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, where one of Yeshua's names is Sar Shalom, the Prince of Peace. And that term prince means Sar. It's more like a field marshal of sorts. Well, one of the problems with this theory is that the prince in Ezekiel 40 through 46 isn't a Sar. The prince in Ezekiel is a Nasi. It's a totally different kind of a leader. It's a different person altogether. Now notice there's other reasons that this can't be Yeshua, meaning Yeshua won't be here on earth. So in Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 22, it says, and on that day, the prince or the Nasi shall prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering. And people say, well, that has to be Yeshua. And I say, how can that be Yeshua? Because the prince will prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering. But Yeshua was the spotless, blemishless lamb. He doesn't need a sin offering for himself. It doesn't make sense that that would be Yeshua. Now, there's other questions that show us that this can't be Yeshua. For example, in Ezekiel 46 and verse 16, it says, thus says Yahweh Elohim, if the Nasi, gives a gift of some of his inheritance to any of his sons, it shall belong to his sons. It is their possession by inheritance. So people sometimes say this prince must be Yeshua because they can't imagine Yeshua being up in the heaven in the throne room with those who are sitting on the thrones. But one of the problems is Yeshua going to take an earthly wife and have earthly sons? It doesn't make sense. This is the model people ascribe to the Nephilim. So these are just two of the many verses which show why Yeshua cannot be physically present on earth during the millennium. If you want more references, I encourage you, please go to the NazareneIsrael.org website and download a copy of Revelation in the End Times. You can purchase it on Amazon.com at our cost. So there will be a 1,000-year reign in fulfillment of Genesis 2 and verse 3. And then in the next slide set, we'll see how Satan will be released from his prison, and he will marshal all the armies of the world again, Gog and Magog, to the second war of Gog and Magog. And then we will see how the earth continues a little while before Yeshua's fourth and final return at the earth's destruction. Thank you for joining me. Please join me again for part 17. Shalom.